Okay. Welcome back. I've been gone a good while, but let us discuss the issue of democratic socialism. This has been coming up, especially with the success of DSA candidates within the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is full charge, attacking that these are communists, they're not even socialists, and blah, blah, blah. They're trying to tie it in with Nazism, which is absolutely ridiculous. As we're soon about to see, let us look at what democratic socialism actually is here. Now, let's look at the term. The term is not democratic socialism with a capital D, as I keep seeing people put in. It has nothing to do with the damn Democratic Party. This is a bastardization of the capitalization. Its common usages with both democratic and socialism being lowercase. Democratic is an adjective, socialism is a noun, but not a proper noun. However, it was originally written as democratic socialism with the big S, the exact opposite of what you see so often. And that's because of where this comes from. I think it had to do with the editor because the author does not use it commonly that way. That they wanted big capitalized letters for what was being discussed. That is capitalism, socialism, communism, and fascism. The word democratic is describing socialism, not democratic with the big D as we discussed. It has nothing to do with that Democratic Party. So let us look at the late 1800s. This is where we got our beginning. There's a period in the late 1800s where, due to the way that some European languages use the noun adjective word order and others use adjective noun word order, that democratic socialism and social democracy were used interchangeably. Of course, socialism and communism themselves were originally used interchangeably as well. Lenin is the person who changed that. But this lasted just a couple decades before the name social democracy was settled upon, and that's what people were using. You may still have a form where it's uh, still adjective noun uh, in languages that may focus on that. English is definitely social democracy. Uh, that is what they went with, social being the adjective, democracy being the noun. These are two different concepts, they're not the same thing. What I find amazing is that since before Bernie gained popularity in the United States to the modern day, Wikipedia has managed to keep it where Americans have not taken over the definition of democratic socialism because it's used everywhere else completely differently than Americans use it. We should also point out that these late 1800s, very early 1900s, is also when Vladimir Lenin described himself as a social democrat. So things were changing. Obviously, Lenin is not a social democrat as we would understand it today. The words were, or the terms were still morphing a lot. But let's get to where it's properly coined. This is George Orwell's essay from 1941 entitled The Lion and the Unicorn, Socialism and the English Genius. Full text you can get online. I used to go straight to the Orwell Foundation. Their link no longer works. I don't know why. It's really weird. But Telelib shows up in the Google results at the very top. It's nice. There's also a Russian site that seems to have the correct stuff. I don't want to point somebody to a Russian site, so I'm not going to point you there. But during this essay, Orwell used the words next to each other once during the entire thing, capitalizing capitalism, fascism, communism, socialism throughout. And this line is, "It is a fact that any rich man, unless he is a Jew, has less to fear from fascism than either communism or democratic socialism." So it's very important to look here at how he is using it. He is contrasting communism, by which he is referring to the Stalinist bastardization. He's not speaking about the Marxist definition, or Lenin would call the communism. It's called the higher stage in Marxism. But they're not talking about the stateless society that everyone was supposedly working towards, because the state literally dissolves under communism. They're talking about what Stalin made it into, which was state capitalism, that he called socialism in one state after Lenin said they needed state capitalism, until a revolution in the West pulled them through. So Stalin just basically lied and said, "Oh, we got socialism." They didn't, but they're called the Communist Party. So people just refer to them as communists, and this is communism, despite that's not being what communism actually is. They never claimed to have gotten there. They claimed to have gotten to socialism, and they did not get there. And there's a whole thing that's a whole nother story. I'm not going to go into it here. But we want to point out the "unless he is a Jew" part is also point that we say Orwell's talking about fascism. He means Nazism first and foremost. And that is really what he discusses within the whole thing. He's talking about the Germans. And so, no, it's very much different than the other things. His works before this only spoke of socialism. If you read any of them, he doesn't say democratic socialism, he says socialism, because that's what he was writing for. Afterwards, he switched, it seems, to democratic socialism fully. In his later work, Why I Write, he says, "Every line of serious work that I've written since 1936, mind you, this is 5 years prior, has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism as I understand it." This is stressing that he is meaning the same thing here. Democratic socialism is what he used to call socialism. It is a specification contrasting it with Stalin. That is where it is. And of course, Orwell fought in the Spanish Civil War and blamed Stalin's forces for just taking over and throwing the anarchists out and losing the whole war in the end. So he was definitely not in favor of Stalin. But this is what his whole thing is. So probably, most likely, and this is supposition here, he wrote it that way, and somebody looked at him and said, "That's a really nice way that you put it. We should call it democratic socialism." And then somebody else told him the same thing, and so on. And so he just adopted it, and then we all sort of adopted it. Democratic socialism is socialism in the Marxist sense. So let's look at how he defines it specifically. Because he's defining socialism here, but that's the same thing as democratic socialism, as we just discussed. Orwell was stressing the democratic nature of socialism and contrasts it with the communism, which is often actually spelled even in the modern day with a capital C, at least in activist circles, to differentiate it from small c communism that we were I went into talking about a little bit about the difference there, but that's a whole nother video. Everywhere it's contrasted with capitalism. It is not capitalism. You cannot be a capitalist and a democratic socialist. You must be one or the other. These are completely things at odds. And so, a simple definition: the collective ownership and control of the means of production. What is capitalism? The private ownership and control of the means of production. These are two different things, which is the point. Democracy extended to the economic sector, something I was saying about a decade ago a lot, because I thought that was a good way of looking at it. I've heard other people use it since. I don't know if they were in, if they heard me say it or heard somebody who heard somebody who heard somebody who heard me say it. But one way or another, I'm not the only person who describes it that way anymore. I also like to call it the self-employment of the working class. This is where, rather than being employed by private owners, the working class owns and controls everything collectively, and so they're self-employing themselves. So they're getting the full value of their labor. That's the point. But they must be actually in control. This is generally accepted throughout the world. And once again, like I said, the US alone, people think that democratic socialism can be capitalist or confuse it with social democracy. But Orwell defined it in a more complex way than I have. So let's go through Orwell's definition. First, address the common definition of socialism people were using. And this is his quote: socialism is usually defined as common ownership of the means of production. Crudely, the state, representing the whole nation, owns everything, and everyone is a state employee. This does not mean that people are stripped of private possessions such as clothes and furniture, but it does mean that all productive goods, such as land, mines, ships, and machinery, are the property of the state. This is the difference between private property and personal property. The state is the sole large scale producer. Now, I do want to point out that there are versions of democratic socialism which are more anarchist and a bit more where you have individual shops working together, but each shop is individually owned collectively by the people. It's not what I favor, but it is something that exists. However, Orwell argued that it was not enough to describe socialism as such. He suggested a few other factors necessary to make something socialism. First, the approximate equality of incomes. They don't need to be more than approximate, just so long as you don't have people who have massive economic power over one another. That was very much a key. And this can harken back to Aristotle, even, where he said, because Aristotle was talking about how the rich and the poor alike are unfit for society, or the polis, the city, because one can only rule and the other one can only be ruled, and so only the people in the middle who are approximately equal in their incomes, who are able to both rule and rule in turn. And so this very well, I mean, it's possible that he got it from there, but it definitely correlates with Aristotle. He mentions political democracy. It's not just the collective ownership, but that collective control of the means of production. And he also says abolition of all hereditary privilege, especially in education. So that would mean also things like you don't want to say, oh, I want Chelsea Clinton to be president because I like Bill Clinton as a president. That's not a mindset you want to have in democratic socialism. That's how you create that sort of hereditary privilege. And Orwell's about to go into why generally all this works together. But I think it's very important with that there. Centralized ownership has very little meaning unless the mass of people are living roughly upon an equal level and have some kind of control over the government. The state may come to mean no more than a self elected political party, and oligarchy and privilege can return based on power rather than money. So when you're going picking somebody because they're somebody else's kid or their wife, you're creating that imbalance of power that people have. The others who may be more qualified don't have the equal chance to get up to that level. Orwell expanded upon our understanding of socialism, with Marxist concerns central to his critique of the common definition. This is about class liberation, not taming capitalism, nor is it communism. But what about communism? Okay, I guess I did go into it. I wrote this like 2 weeks ago. I'm very much not doing what I should be doing here. Communism, as Orwell used, is a result of feudal societies not ready for socialism, having a revolution too early. Marx had suggested that once feudal Russia can be dragged through capitalism and into socialism by a socialist revolution in Western Europe, economically helping them develop the necessary means of production. Because with Marx, it very much matters about whether you have the means of production that allow for this sort of thing. And clearly, you do not have that with the feudal society. If it's feudal, it is not ready for socialism. They need to develop the tools to allow for capitalism, go into capitalism. Marx saw capitalism as a step forward. And then after you've developed enough in capitalism and you've built the factories that are necessary for socialism, for that collective ownership, where you have such high level capital for entry into competition that you cannot, as an average person, get in, then you go to socialism. And that's something that people often miss about Marx. Even Marxists miss that about Marx. They'll go mention, oh, dialectical materialism and all that, but no, they don't actually keep in mind that you need to have a certain level of society. And a lot of them are not actually Marxists, but you have, or nor are they even Marxist Leninists. They're Stalinists, but they call themselves Marxist Leninists. And they want to make excuses for China and for Russia and for a whole bunch of African countries, Southeast Asian countries that were pressed under colonialism. And because of that, they lost centuries of development and did not have the means of production necessary for socialism. But they want to call them socialists anyways. So, they make excuses. So Lenin undid socialist organizations in Russia and replaced them with state capitalism, which explains why and how it wasn't a betrayal of the revolution in his argument. In A Tax in Kind, that's another text you can find online easily. Marxist.org has it. Stalin later declared state capitalism be socialism in one country, in defiance of both Marx and Lenin. So if you're Stalinist, you are not a Marxist at all. It's just one of those damn things. Now, what about the other communism? So we're not talking about big C communism anymore. We're talking about small c communism. Now, communism with the small c is a term that used to be used interchangeably with socialism. There was a lower stage and a higher stage. Love him or hate him, Lenin did good by calling the lower stage socialism and the higher stage communism. He gave us nice little working language there. Communism is a stage that requires all necessary work to be automated so that everyone can just do whatever they want all day, like the rich do now. Um, they can make music one day, write poetry or write philosophy the next, and then smith armor on the day after, whatever they choose to do. Nobody has to work. Um, Even Marx himself, mind you, he's writing in the middle of the 1800s. He saw it as easy as pushing a button for most things. You want a chair, you push a button, a machine makes a chair for you. Boom, no more scarcity. He conceded that people may have to do things with sanitation, just rotate that little bit of work, but not much. Um, what we should not be surprised he did not have the concept of is the idea of a robot run by AI. That is something that we really developed in the maybe 40s and 50s of the next century. So he's 100 years too early. And we're just now getting around to where you might be able to get some robots that can do basic things. I certainly would not trust any current AI with medical diagnoses or whatnot, any sort of complex tasks like that cannot be immediately checked by a human. So that we're not on the cusp, even though some people want to pretend we are. But basically, it's automated everything. Nobody has to do a damn thing. You could literally sit around and, oh, you're provided for. But that's not human nature. Marx went into human nature being creative, that people want to do things. You want to be the poet, you want to be the artist, you want to be the actor. But not everybody can do that. This whole thing, I'm going to have to go in eventually to details of Marx species man and natural man needs and all that fun stuff. But this is what communism is. Everything is automated, first off. Now, because of that, scarcity ceases to be. There's no more a limited amount of chairs that people can have. So how are you going to charge for a chair? You just simply people get the chairs they want. There's no more scarcity of chairs. Um, and as the state merely exists in Marx's mind to regulate such disparities, I would disagree that the state does have a little bit more, but we're talking about Marx here. Um, it loses its purpose to exist and it dissolves completely. You have complete anarchy because the state's not necessary anymore. So actual communism is anarchy. You don't have a repressive Soviet state, totalitarianism going over. You have no government whatsoever. People don't need to be governed. I would say you still have issues. Rape is not an issue of money. A lot of times when people kill another person, it's not an issue of money. There's still crimes that happen. You have necessity for a state, but it's going to be a much smaller state than what you have now if you have communism. And Star Trek is an attempt at this by a military or Navy veteran specifically. And imagine that without Starfleet's hierarchy of command. That is your luxury space communism people have been telling you about. Now, no communist country claims to have achieved communism. That is merely a goal. They claim to have achieved socialism, which they have not. So, defining capitalism, and this is how it's defined by Orwell again in that same paper. What this war has demonstrated is that private capitalism, that is, an economic system in which land, factories, mines, and transport are owned privately and operated solely for profit, does not work. It cannot deliver the goods. This fact has been known to millions of people for years past, but nothing ever came of it because there was no real urge from below to alter the system, and those at the top had trained themselves to be impenetrably stupid on just this point. Argument and propaganda got one nowhere. The lords of property simply sat on their bottoms and proclaimed that all was for the best. Hitler's conquest of Europe, however, was a physical debunking of capitalism. War, for all its evil, is at any rate an unanswerable test of strength. Try your grit machine. Great strength returns the penny, and there is no way of faking the result. So, the very first part is sort of important with his definition that it's privately owned and operated. The rest of it is him talking about how it's a failure. I think it's important to point out that Orwell very much was not a capitalist. He was anti capitalist. A lot of people like to put him there because 1948 is an attack on Stalin, but he was a socialist. He was attacking Stalin for not being a socialist. And yeah, we've really taught that wrong for so many damn years in America. Now, defining fascism, and Orwell misdefines fascism, but his insights weren't true. But insights weren't truly available yet. This was still during World War II. Um, I am going to do a video eventually on fascism itself, talking about what it is. So I do have videos on both fascism and Nazism that cover enough that if you pay attention through the long 3-hour videos, well, one's 3 hours, one's 2 hours, you'll have a good idea of what fascism is. But this is about Orwell's definition. A form of capitalism that borrows just enough from socialism to be useful for war production. He's talking about the control of by the state, even though it's a hierarchical control, not a collective control. While socialism strives for equality amongst human beings, fascism strives for the opposite, hierarchy. Its goal isn't profit first, but conquest and subjugation first. Because capitalism is profit first. Fascism is more about power dynamics. And I'll just hint that it's really a recreation of feudal society. So is DSA is a socialist or is a communist? Is either. Individual members may be socialists, but the organization is not socialist. DSA is one of 3 splinter groups from the destruction of the Socialist Party of America in 1968, along with the Socialist Party USA and the Social Democrats, USA, which is what the Socialist Party of America renamed itself after the other 2 left. DSA's strategy was entryism. This is something that Trotskyists do a lot, but this is non-Trotskyists doing it. They would enter the Democratic Party and push it left. It has managed 50 years later, when it first got members elected, to replicate the Democratic Party it was trying to push left when it started. AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Zohran Mamdani, they're really not socialists. They haven't shown any sign of being socialists. AOC very specifically claimed that you could be both a democratic socialist and a democratic socialist and a capitalist, which shows that she doesn't even understand ideologically what democratic socialism is. She's not a stupid person. She just really doesn't know, because DSA has been that divorced from the socialist movement for so long. They are recreating the same sort of thing that, well, we'll go into here. DSA is that old New Deal style Democrats, the organization which seeks to tame capitalism through what is called welfare liberalism. That is something that was very successful at keeping people happy, creating economic abundance, though it still had exploitation. It still used division between people to try to keep them from uniting as a class. But it was much more successful than what we've had with neoliberalism. And this is called welfare liberalism. And this is an old term. It's not the derogatory thing that you would hear nowadays from Republicans. Welfare liberalism is a branch of liberalism which says that people do not have freedoms which they cannot afford to exercise. You do not have the freedom to work where you choose if you cannot afford to leave your job. You do not have the freedom to live where you wish if you cannot afford to move. You do not have the freedom to become what you want if you cannot afford education. Um, it is very much a critique of how capitalism is working without throwing out capitalism. It wants to make capitalism work. Um, and we should point out there socialism is also coming from the same point, but socialism comes to the different conclusion that capitalism does not work. Like Orwell just said, capitalism doesn't work. Um, but DSA as an organization is this. Um, there is some chance that you may have certain members, even some elected members, may be socialists, but they're still working from a framework of that welfare liberalism. They are nowhere near to establishing socialism. Even the closest thing I've seen is Mamdani creating the grocery stores, the collectively owned grocery stores. Um, and there is that's collectively controlled as well. What they are missing, the thing that you would definitely see if you had a democratic socialist in charge. That makes me think Mamdani is definitely not a democratic socialist. He is either a social democrat or a welfare liberal. Is worker control. The workers are not having control over how day to day operations run there, at least as far as we've heard. If you really want to push Mamdani to do something more, that would be a good thing. Hey, you say you're a democratic socialist. How about giving workers control over how they operate things within there? That is a democratic socialist thing. It's how DSA differs in a large part. And you don't necessarily, I'm not saying Mamdani is bad by any means. Mamdani is a good step forward. There's a question of if that's going to make people not ask for more. But given that we've hit the point of fascism, we don't have a socialist movement ready to go. I am going to say we are fine with moving to Mamdani for right now. And that is a good step forward. Now, let's compare social democracy versus welfare liberalism. Welfare liberalism seeks to tame capitalism, while social democracy seeks to slowly establish socialism over time. There's two different goals here, but they essentially follow the same policies with different intentions. As such, they are often confused with one another. Both will use widespread social programs to enrich the lives of their populations. Social Democrats will nationalize existing industries that seem most obvious in the interest of slowly establishing socialism. Welfare liberals will establish industries where private capital finds it unprofitable to do so. And a good example of this is the Tennessee Valley Authority. that was created in the New Deal. I mean, it's a shit show now, but let's talk about the. Let me go back here. Um, let's go talk about what it was back in the New Deal. Tennessee Valley, no company wanted to touch that. It wasn't going to be profitable enough. No, we're not going to do it. So one of the New Deal programs was creating the Tennessee Valley Authority. Give power to these places that corporations won't touch. It managed to run a profit. It also had the cheapest electricity and the highest wages at the time. It was showing how much better you can do without the profit motive. They managed to be better. The Tennessee Valley Authority has been since privatized and turned to a shit show. But when it first started, it was a nationalized entity, or maybe there should be a different term for it. But it was a collectively created entity. It was collectively owned. Had some sense of collective control, but they only did it because private capital wouldn't do it. They weren't going to force private capital to do it. It's like, okay, fine, we'll do it because these people need electricity. They need to come to the modern world. So social democracy was critiqued in the late 19th century that it would squander revolutionary fervor and the people will be too cozy with the tamer capitalism and it wouldn't want to go further. This proved correct. The social democratic countries of the post-war era, movements arose to re-privatize certain industries. The work done before was undone in part, and they basically decayed into welfare liberalism. I do not accept that Sweden or Finland or Norway or Denmark are social democracies. They used to be. And you don't see a whole lot in the policy differences. What the difference is the goal. You can see how the citizens talk about it. They do not see themselves as seeking socialism. They have a nicer, kinder capitalism. And that's what DSA is trying to create. That nicer, kinder capitalism. They're just doing worse than misusing the term social democracy. They're misusing the word democratic socialist. So, why do Americans get this so wrong? And the answer is Bernie Sanders. Yes, Bernie Sanders. Long ago, he was an actual democratic socialist. He was a member of the Liberty Union Party, which essentially was the Vermont state organization for the Socialist Party USA. My PowerPoint's wrong. That happens a lot whenever people make this. If this was a class, I'd be redoing it. In the 1970s, he was a star, speaking about nationalizing media and such. He was elevated and eventually ran and won the mayorship of Burlington, Vermont, under the Liberty Union Party. Then he eventually left the Liberty Union Party. And in 1984, he made a total break when he endorsed Mondale for president. Walter Mondale. This upset socialists who believed in independent political action. DSA would have been fine with it. They probably would have still been socialists back then. But the party that Bernie was part of, or was recently part of before this, wasn't going for it. And Bernie tamed his rhetoric and became who you know today. He kept the descriptor Democratic Socialist because dropping it would signal him selling out. And he did sell out in the 1980s, before you knew who he was or fell in love with him. So I'm not saying he's a sellout from, oh, what you love about Bernie. He's a sellout from before that. And it's not that he's, you know, a shady person. It's you have to recognize that he sold out to understand why this is being misused. He is holding on to it because he doesn't want to highlight that he's changed his political views that significantly over that period of time. He's been pretty damn steady since then. So if you love him, that's cool. You're, he's that's who he is. But he was a lot cooler before. And I should also point out, I've had the joy of speaking to people such as Peter Diamondstone. Peter Diamondstone, his kids and Bernie Sanders' kids grew up together. These two were best friends. They would spend nights talking politics all night long and whatnot. And I think, given that and his eventual stance that Bernie was never a socialist, he's claimed that Bernie was never really a socialist. So maybe he didn't sell out. But I think that Bernie was, but wasn't fully sold on it. I do think that Diamond Stone was hurt by what he felt as betrayal from a close friend. And Bernie saw that as the way forward, not out of personal gain. He thought like his politics changed. So maybe sellout might be the wrong word, but he's definitely fundamentally changed, and selling out is sort of the idea or the word that's often used with that. If you have a better word, feel free to submit it in the comments. But here is a actual photo of Bernie Sanders speaking at a Socialist Party USA event. This is young Bernie. He still has some gray or black in his hair. But he looked old at the time too. You gotta keep in mind this is like 40 years ago. And that's how Bernie looked 40 years ago. But I got this. David McReynolds, long since passed, shared this on Facebook a long time ago. I know someone else who is in the photo. I'm not sure whether it's the person on the far left or far right. They look nothing like that now. It's the person on the far left. But they look now they transitioned since then, and I believe actually went to the Soviet Union with Bernie that once. But so I tried to get it redone to look a little bit sharper. By Google could not do this. Google Gemini cannot do a young Bernie, even when given a picture of young Bernie. They turned him into an old man. Person I know, he looks fine. The guy on the far right looks fine. The guy in the back may have changed slightly, but Bernie, they had to make Bernie more Bernie-like, and that's got to be a little bit funny. So thank you. The point of this is to understand what democratic socialism is, what it is not. DSA is not democratic socialism, but it's far from big C communism. It's far from fucking Nazism. It is welfare liberalism. It is that same New Deal. It's what frickin' fought the Nazis. And that is really reclaiming a better period in our history. It's not creating a new period. There is long term, a lot better needs to be done than DSA. But when you're looking at it, DSA is not the boogeyman they're making it out to be. They're people who pretend to be further left than they actually are. And in this particular moment, without an organized left, that's probably what this country needs given the current political climate. So I am not, I am not trying to dissuade you from them, but let's be honest about what they are. They're not democratic socialists. They're far from what their party founders were 50 years ago, or their group within the Democratic Party's founders were 50 years ago. Um, though there are people I know from the Socialist Party USA who swung over, said, you know what, I'm done with independent political action. I'm going to back the DSA now that they've had some success. And I can say that they're socialists. I know that. I've spoken in detail with people who are now over there. And they'll say, yeah, not everybody's a socialist over there. But main thing, don't fear the DSA. So if you're hearing crazy things from Nazis about how DSA is trying to take over the country and take all power for themselves, no, that's the freaking Nazis called MAGA. And everything that they accuse somebody of, they did themselves. Some of the stuff takes a while for you to feel, oh, they did that. And sometimes it's very clear and obvious. You're literally doing that right now, but that's what it is. So do not fear them. And that is the whole point of this. And hopefully you have a much better understanding of these ideologies after this discussion. And I plan on doing something else radically different before. I think I'm going to cover Plato and Aristotle to get back to my first video where we try to actually go into political theory step by step. Thank you once again.